Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for zooming in from various patches of the planet in solidarity with the children and families of Ukraine and those who are working tirelessly to protect their rights. I recognize it was another tough night in Kiev, and our partners joining us from Ukraine may be tired. Thank you for your courage and your tenacity and your leadership. Before we begin, let's make sure that everyone can access the Zoom interpretation if they need it. There's a globe at the bottom of your screen, and Zoom is a little bit behind the times and does not list Ukrainian as a language option, so please select German, and what you will hear is instead Ukrainian. If you prefer to hear the interpreters only without the speaker's voice in the background, please select mute original audio. My name is Gillian Hubner, and I lead the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. It's an honor to welcome you today for a conversation that's jointly convened with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, Razum for Ukraine, Where Are Our People, and the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. As you are already aware, thousands of children have been separated from their families, communities, and country and forcibly transferred to Russian-occupied territories or deported to Russia. The situation is absolutely egregious. It's beyond a scale that we've seen in recent history. International law is unambiguous, and yet the mechanisms for enforcement and accountability are proving to be inadequate, as thousands of children and families remain forcibly separated across conflict lines. Today, we will hear from those closest to the challenge, working on the front lines of child rights and protection. Participants will offer updates on the current situation and provide historical context. Ukrainian organizations engaged in the frontline response will share their perspectives, and we will discuss the limits and possibilities of the international response. I'd like to thank the extraordinary team of people who have helped to organize this event: Max Krimberg, Anastasia Maroshevska, Vladislav Havrilov, Natalia Letik, and Anna Vodchenko. Many thanks too to our interpreters, Yehor Kaputinsky and Ilya Olenik. I'm going to hand over now to Katya Pavlich, a remarkable advocate and organizer with Razum for Ukraine and Where Are Our People.
Thank you so much, Gillian. Thank you for being the drive force behind this webinar. Thank you, Georgetown University, for hosting it. Gillian and I met at another panel in DC dedicated to the issues of children, and in the conversation with each other, we realized that webinars like this, topics, discussions take place a lot of times. Many of them are focused on one angle or another regarding deportations, and there are very few conversations focused on what is actually has to be done to return children now. And that kind of inspired this event today. And we put a lot of efforts to gather panelists who will share their expertise and will actually provide the input in what should be done, what is happening right now to return Ukrainian children abducted by Russia. I would like to introduce the first panelist, Daria Gerasimchuk, who is the President's Commissioner of Children's Rights and Rehabilitation, whose work is mostly focused right now exactly on the deported children of Ukraine. Daria, to you.
Вітаю. Обстріли, сирени, підвали, бомбосховища.
So the shellings, the shelters, it's impossible to visit the schools and kindergartens, play alone and talk to friends, give the hugs to those who we love, like we used to do in February 2022. Right now, the life of Ukrainian children is like this. And now those toys of our children, these are the particles of Russian rockets. More than 500 days passed after Russians intervened in Ukraine. And since that time, the countdown started for those children. throughout this time, the victims of Russians are more than 1,500 children, and we unfortunately don't have the exact numbers from the occupied territories, but from what we know for now, 494 children died, and they didn't die, they were killed, they were murdered. 1,052 children got injured.
Отже, почнемо знову. На жаль, сирени.
So unfortunately, the sirens, the shelters, inability to visit schools and kindergartens and play alone with friends and give the hugs to those who we love, like we used to do before the February 2022. This is the life of Ukrainian children now. And I want to emphasize that these are the toys of Ukrainian children now. These are particles of Russian rockets. There are more than 500 days passed after the Russian intervention in Ukrainian territory. And since then, there was a countdown of the victims of Ukrainian children of this war. And throughout the days of full-scale invasion, the victims are more than 1,500 Ukrainian children. These are what we exactly know. And we don't have a lot of information from occupied territories, but from what we know for now, that 494 children were murdered by Russians and 1,052 were injured. And at least 13 of children were sexually raped that we documented. And these are not just numbers, that every number of those statistics is a separate world that was destroyed by Russian army. And I am, as the Commissar of Children Rights and Safety in Ukraine from President of Ukraine, I am the coordinator of the United Informational Platform of Children of War. This platform was created by President Volodymyr Zelensky, and it helps to gather the information about children who suffered from the war, to help them, to help those who we can help, and also to share the statistics. This is the unified way to enter the statistical information for children, for parents, and for those who are interested in those data. For now, on this platform, you can see 19,474 children that were deported or intentionally moved. What is this number? Now in Ukraine, we have the National Bureau. This is a structure that receive data from any people, from parents or relatives who are telling information about children that were removed. Also, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Security Service of Ukraine, State Prosecutor Office. These are those who are verifying this information, and after the check, we move this information to the Register of National Informational Bureau. So this is the number, this is the way how we get this number. But now we have to talk about some exact numbers. And the biggest number of that we heard from Russians themselves is 700,000 of those children who were evacuated from Ukraine. But there are no lists or documents, and there are no reports from Russia to any international organization. And in Ukraine, there are no data as well. Who are those children? How they count those children, we don't know for now. How we counted, truthfully, we can talk about 200,000 or 300,000 children that they potentially could steal. So we don't trust Russian numbers. Why don't we just name the exact number? At least the territories are still occupied, and the exact information is not accessible about these children. And only after the occupation of any town or city, we can check if there is a family with this or that children. And after that, we are starting looking for, and even though we're talking about 200,000 or 300,000 deported children, we as a country, with a state, we are communicating about 19,493 children. This is our official number, and we can prove any kind of information about this exact number. But unfortunately, we don't know about majority of those who are being stolen. And Russians are hiding our children. They're constantly moving them. They're changing their names. They're faking their documents. And there is a coordinational council of safety and protection of children from the president of Ukraine that is tightly working with Ukrainian and international organizations that are looking for any kind of ways of scenarios of stopping this genocide of Ukrainian nation done by Russians through Ukrainian children. And these organizations are working on returning back Ukrainian children back to Ukraine. And in order to implement this program that is called Bring Kids Back in UA, there are seven steps. The first one is searching for children and looking for the ways to get them back. Also, there is a project of development of families, for developing the families that can take those children back. Reintegration of children, the education, any kind of education for them. Also the Center of Children's Safety in Kyiv, and also fixating the murders and the crimes of Russians. Also the co-working in parliamentary structures, and also anything that can be done about this in order to implement this project. For now, there are 0 organizations that are suggesting any kind of ways of returning Ukrainian children back. So nobody is really suggesting anything to be done about this. This situation really showed the absence of any international way of saving children in this kind of situation. So there are some documents in Geneva Convention and Convention of United Nations about the child rights, and theoretically it might have been working, but only if all of those who signed this document would follow the rules, but they don't, as long as we have in Russian Federation in this list of those who signed. And we worked with ICIS, also with the UN Commission, even with Moscow mechanism of OBSE. So we are trying everything, and we are documenting everything. We are focusing on everything we can. So we are trying to prevent this. So we're doing everything we can to solve this. But now I urge everyone to understand that saving Ukrainian children now is forming a new global safety system for the whole world, for children. And unfortunately, it happens with the victims of Ukrainian children and people, but this is the reality. But everyone has to remember that today, these are children of Ukraine, and tomorrow it can be the child of any other state and country in the world. And I really hope that together, the international community would find the steps to push, to put pressure on Russia, to look for the mechanism to solve it and to stop this genocide, and find ways to pressure Russia to get the Ukrainian children back home.
Thank you, Daria, for your powerful speech, and the information you provided is incredibly valuable. What would you name is the main area, the main issue you need help with from international organizations or foreign governments? What is the most urgent need for you to do a job you would name?
Найбільша потреба сьогодні це
So the biggest need now is the most possible pressure, political pressure on Russia, because Russia doesn't understand any other instruments or mechanisms. Now they have to feel that there is a global world isolation, because now they are acting like maniacs. And when maniac is stealing neighbors' children and saying that it will be better for this child to be with me, I'll support all of this interest, I'll give this child the best education and food and everything. And this is just a simple way of thinking, and we just going around saying that you cannot do this, it's impossible, but the maniac is continuing doing this, and this maniac is able to use any kind of things that they need. They can buy gasoline to power their vehicles, they can buy food, and of course when they don't feel the consequences of their actions, they're not able to stop this. And I think that the international community has to do everything so Russians can feel this isolation and the consequences of what they're doing, the most cruel sanctions, so they can feel that there might be a result of what they're doing. And without this punishment, they won't do anything. This is what I believe.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Harasamchuk. This was important background, and for those who would like to look back on some of the resources shared, you can see in the chat the Government of Ukraine's website is listed, and as well as the Conflict Observatory report from Yale University, which provides some important background information. We're going to move now to Vladislav Havrilov, who is a researcher and historian and seminarian. He's also a new research fellow with the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues at Georgetown University. So delighted to have him as part of our team. Vlad, can you give us some historical context? This is not the first time deportations have happened in Ukraine and with Russia. So if you can give us a few minutes of context. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to tell about a historical context of forcible deportation of Ukrainians. Russia doing a full-scale invasion Ukraine, and every day we receive information about more and more victims. Unfortunately, the goals of the Russian occupiers are more global, not only physically, but also mentally destroy Ukrainians and to erase national identity in the occupied territories. Russian invaders with their collaborators carry out forced deportation, which include the forced eviction of Ukrainian peoples, especially children, to Russia, and illegal adoption of hundreds of them, and forced Russification and militarization in special camps in the territory of Russian Federation, where these children are replaced. It should be noted that this practice are not new for Russia, but it's come back in practice to the USSR mass repression. And one of mass and first deportation against Ukrainian was in 1930s. Soviet deportation became systematic and were connected with a forced collectivization of Ukrainian villagers. It's a forcible system to joining of own farms of Ukrainian villagers to the collective farms created by Soviet regime. The disobedience of Ukrainian villagers and farmers who named as kulaks was suppressed by forcible deportation to Siberia. If we said about numbers of victims, the Soviet evicted more than 100,000 people from February to May 1930, and 120,000 1,000 peoples from June to July 1931. The new wave of deportation followed shortly after, when the Soviet invasion in western part of Ukraine. The first wave, conducted in February 1940, affected 89,000 people. The second wave in April-May 1940, it's more than 30,000 people. The third wave began in the summer of 1940. It's targeted 83,000 peoples. And the last fourth wave of forcible deportation from Western Ukraine in Soviet period, it's about 20,000 people. And in general, the Soviet deported 1,173,000 people from Western regions of Ukraine from September 1939 to June 1941. During the Second World War, the Nazis practiced the abduction and numbing of children in the occupied territories, primarily in Central and Eastern Europe. Researchers estimated the number between 50,000 children from the territory of the USSR who are forcibly deported to the Nazi Germany. This practice names Lebensborn. Most of these children never known about their true nationality and identity. After the end of the Second World War, Soviet mass deportation returned to Western Ukraine and forcibly deported more than 78,000 people. It's called Operation West. And it should be noted that after these people are deported, they left in special settlements in Russian Siberia. And in these places, they tried to Russify Ukrainian children as much as possible and called them Nazi collaborators, children whose parents fought in the national struggle against the Soviet and Nazi occupation in the Ukrainian insurgent army. And we should say shortly about modern deportation. Since the full-scale invasion, Russia once again reviewed the same criminal methods what they used in the Soviet times. Russian network of temporarily accommodation centers. In fact, filtration facilities precisely repeat Soviet concentration camps. And according to Ukrainian Ombudsman Dmytro Lubinets, at least 2,800,000 of Ukrainians have been deported to Russia. At the same time that information from UNHCR are indicated 2.8 million Ukrainian citizens in the Russian Federation and about the 16,705 Ukrainian citizens are in Republic in Belarus. Trying to find the number of deported children, the data is also very different, but the scale is impressive. The Children of War website indicated that from Russian resources, it's more than 744,000 children have been deported. But the platform has identified 19,474 children who were deported from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to Russia. And we should say about that identified children, it's more than 19,000, but non-identified children, it's maybe 200,000, maybe 300,000 of children. We not known clearly information right now about this.
Thank you so much, Vlad. That's important historical context. So now we're going to move into the response and who has the responsibility to act. Katya.
Yes, I think since our webinar is focused on search for solutions, the most logical thing would be to explore the legal mechanisms in place to resolve the issue of repatriation of children. And I would like to introduce two amazing lawyers, Erin Farrell-Rosenberg and Katerina Rashevska. And Erin will speak on the topic covering the state responsibility and compliance mechanism of international humanitarian, international human rights law.
Thank you very much, Katya. It's really an honor to be here with you. Thank you to the host of this important conversation and my esteemed co-panelists. In terms of the law, maybe just to set out very, very briefly, the transfer or deportation of civilians is an international crime. Specifically, it can be a war crime or a crime against humanity. And under this framework, it is not, of course, limited to children, but children are included in these crimes. It is also potentially a human rights violation, a violation of international human rights, including the right to reside in one's home, the right to reside within one's community, as well as having implications on the right to freedom of movement. Finally, the transfer and deportation of children is also potentially an underlying act of genocide under the Genocide Convention, which under Article 2E provides that the forcible transfer of children from the group, being the national group of Ukrainians, to another group is an act of genocide. And I think it's important to understand that under the Genocide Convention, genocide can be committed by acts that other than mass killing, one of which is the forcible removal of children. Finally, I do also want to highlight, in terms of what our previous speakers have mentioned, is that ethnic cleansing, the movement of a population based on ethnicity or nationality, which under international law is the crime of persecution, a forcible transfer based on national identity, is an indicator of genocidal intent and is relevant to the Genocide Convention. Now, the Genocide Convention and the Human Rights Framework relate to state responsibility. This is different from individual criminal responsibility. And what that means is that, yes, individuals carry out these crimes, and yes, they must be held to account as individuals. But at the same time, states have their own independent obligations as states, as such, that they undertake to respect international law, to not violate international law, and importantly, to remedy any violations of international law that they are responsible for. So under the human rights framework, the relevant treaties which we've heard mentioned, for example, would be the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Each of these conventions have committees, which are enforcement mechanisms, which provide, for example, with not just regular reporting, but mechanisms that allow for states, so other parties that are signatories to that convention, to bring a complaint against another state. They also, some, have an individual complaint system, which would allow an individual to bring a complaint against a state. So the human rights framework does have, at the international level, with our human rights treaty bodies, mechanisms of enforcement that could be used against Russia. But I want to be very clear, and I don't want to raise expectations of something that is very unlikely to happen, that these mechanisms are underfunded, and oftentimes their decisions are ignored. Finally, they operate on a consent-based system, meaning that Russia would have to agree to these procedures, even if it is a signatory to the underlying convention. Now, under the Genocide Convention, we have, of course, the International Court of Justice as a judicial body that can enforce the Genocide Convention. And Ukraine could ask for example, provisional measures to be brought against Russia. However, what I want to highlight is separate from this mechanism under the Genocide Convention, which is that the obligation to prevent genocide is an obligation binding upon all states parties, all contracting parties to the Genocide Convention, the entire international community. And right now, the deportation of Ukrainian children, whether we agree or not that it qualifies as genocide, there is no question that it implicates a serious risk of genocide, which is the trigger, the threshold for all states to take actions when there is a serious risk of genocide. These acts at a minimum qualify as a serious risk of genocide. And what that means is that states have an obligation, all states, to take actions now to stop the deportation of Ukrainian children. So what I would say in closing is I would call on all contracting parties to the Genocide Convention to meet their obligations under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, their obligation to prevent genocide, and to take at a minimum the following steps. 1, to impose and enforce sanctions against all individuals participating or providing support for the deportation of Ukrainian children. 2nd, to provide assistance and financial support not only to Ukraine, but to local civil society organizations on the ground seeking to both prevent the deportation of Ukrainian children as well as operating to return Ukrainian children to their families and to their homes. And finally, it is for the entire international community as a part of their obligation to prevent genocide, to provide aid and assistance to the Ukrainian children, their families, and their communities upon their return, to ensure that they are able to reintegrate and to address the very serious trauma and damage from what has happened to them. And in doing so, hopefully we'll be able to mitigate to some degree the consequences that these children have suffered of this truly horrific act. Thank you very much.
Erin, thank you so much for a good overview of the tools that could be applied right now. I want to pass the word to Katerina Rashevska, who has been working with the topic of deportation of Ukrainian children for some time in Ukraine, and she will be able to propose their mechanism of enforcing all the above-mentioned legal documents.
Thank you, Katya. Right, I cried every night because I wanted to be with my mother. I was only separated from home by a minefield and I was ready to walk through it. Now I will study with you in a Ukrainian school, my little sister. This is what the children who managed to be returned from Russia told me. Now there are 383 of them. However, if we do not find a solid solution, it will take more than 52 years to bring back the other more than 19,000. Little girls and boys, orphans, deprived of parental care, separated from their families by Russians, left in the occupation and transferred for education or medical intervention. Today, I am here addressing you, but one of them may be in a military Uran on the road to 57 regions of Russia, starting from the Rostov region and ended with Primoria, 8,000 kilometers from home. And these children are terrified. Me too. Minors deported to the Russian Federation and Belarus or forcibly transferred to the occupied territories of Ukraine risk becoming victims of serious violations of children's rights, violations of international humanitarian law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. In their report, the experts of the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE noted that numerous violations of children's rights accompany illegal deportations. Non-respect for 14 articles of the Convention on the Protection of Child Rights. This is a quarter of the Convention. Risk of becoming a victim of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, forced mobilization, forced passportization, obstruction of repatriation, and eradication of identity. Crimes that Russia began to commit together with the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, when it illegally deported and gave up for adoption by Russian families more than 1,000 Ukrainian orphans. The process of repatriation of Ukrainian children is extremely complicated. Russia deliberately creates obstacles in the form of additional checks at the border, hours-long preventive talks with representatives of law enforcement agencies, refusal to hand over the child to a legal representative, citing the armed conflict or deficiencies in the documents, and intimidation. In some places, parents and minors were forced to undergo a lie detector test, during which, according to the testimonies, they were humiliated, forcibly naked, threatened with a refusal of repatriation, forced to testify against themselves and their relatives, as well as to provide information about the locations of Ukrainian armed forces. A relative of a boy, Denis, was deported from Russia without explanation and without Denis. Another boy, Bogdan, was detained at the border and again forcibly transferred to a Russian foster family. The obligation of immediate and unconditional repatriation is universally recognized. The relevant article of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions was adopted by consensus. So the United Nations General Assembly should adopt the resolution and remind the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the Security Council, of this obligation. Similar instruments have already been adopted many times in history, for Greece, for Syria, for Liberia, for Mozambique. The international community is at one when reuniting children with their families, when it comes to children as a national value, the strength and the future of the state. The main idea is to demonstrate the determination of the international community to protect Ukrainian children and guarantee their repatriation by appointing a third-party guarantor and concluding an international binding agreement. Unreasonable delay in repatriation is a war crime. The guilty will be held accountable. However, leaving these children in Russia means continuing to commit a crime. So until the last child's leg crosses the Ukrainian border, we will fight. Ukrainian civic society will fight for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katerina. It's important to note that Katerina was one of the authors of the submission to the ICC. So thank you for your really powerful, legally grounded leadership. Thank you so much. Okay, let's talk now about those who are on the front lines of actually identifying, tracing, and reunifying these children. This work is primarily being done by local partners on the ground in Ukraine. I'd like to introduce Mykola Kuleba and Bogdana Yakovenko. Mykola Kuleba is the former commissioner for child rights in Ukraine, and he is the founder and CEO of Save Ukraine, which has been in the news recently. You can see some of the videos. There's an NBC link we'll share in the chats. Mykola, let us know what you're working on, how it's going, and who is supporting you. Are you getting the support from the international agencies with responsibility for these issues?
Hello, I welcome everyone to this webinar highlighting possible ways to save Ukrainian children and the lack of effective mechanism to influence Russia. I would especially like to draw your attention to the point of organization is dealing with. Here is some facts from the work of our organization. When the grandmother went to Russia to pick up her godson, the Russians took her for interrogation by the FSB, which lasted 3 days, and then deported her to Belarus and then Ukraine. The woman turned to the Red Cross to help her escape to Europe, but the organization refused. They said it was not their business. It's another story. A 17-year-old boy studying at a college in the occupied territory, Kherson region, was placed in a basement room for disrespecting Russian state symbols, and his phone was taken away from him. He stayed there for almost a week, unable to watch or read anything without any communication. In the conversation, the boy admitted that he had suicidal thoughts while in this punishment room and almost lost his mind. One guy's mother came to take him home, and the Russians forced the mother and son to strip down to their underwear, stand in front of the Russian flag, and record a video apologizing for their tattoos. The tattoo was made the day before. It was a temporary tattoo. This is not just a humiliation of human dignity. Such actions qualify as a sexual violence. The boy also testified that other boys were electrocuted as a punishment. Another Ukrainian teenager, age 16, who was studying in occupied Henichsk, was thrown into a basement because his socks vaguely resembled a color of the Ukrainian flag. Another 10-year-old Ukrainian girl, due to the usual childish whims, was placed in a psychiatric hospital for a month, where she was treated, given injections, some medications, and tied to a bed. The occupiers said her behavior was inappropriate and sent her to the psychiatric hospital without informing her parents. Because the child was only 10 years old, she couldn't yet understand and tell what exactly was happening to her. Our psychologists are working with her. The UN report states presented to the during the Secretary Council meeting on 22 June that only 41 children were transferred from Ukraine to Russia. And this is at that time when Save Ukraine, my organization, efforts alone have already brought back to Ukraine more than 100 Ukrainian children who were abducted or deported by the Russians. But these are not all children returned, and not all of those who entered Russia after 24th February, because we see that the official figures from the Ukrainian side are entirely different, as well as the number of children reported by the Russian media, which is more than 730,000. And its UN report, it did not want to recognize the terrorist as the terrorist. Thus, we can see that existing international organization supposed to ensure peace and stability in the world fail to solve the current problem in any way and do not even want to work with existing data. Indeed, most international institutions were created in the post-war period and had mainly preventive functions to prevent war, pain, and suffering. And you can read the first line of the UN Charter state, what is written there. But what happened? The whole world just stood by and watched to see if preparations for war in Ukraine were being properly made. We are talking about a war that has been going since 2014 and did nothing, or they were waiting for the Russia Federation written declaration of war in Ukraine. It is necessary to increase pressure on existing international organizations actively and demand that they take effective actions to stop Russia's aggression and protect Ukrainian sovereignty. Demand an objective review of the situation and bring those responsible to justice, or to create new effective international institutions that can take timely decisions to prevent military conflicts, stabilize the situation, and provide adequate assistance to those in need. My organization, Save Ukraine, has been rescuing families with children since the beginning of the war, and now more than 100,000 were rescued. It is women and children. Creating services. We have services, scope of different services for children and their families, and all this with funds from private donors and from several NGOs, for example, All Hands and Hearts, and from support of USAID for some services and our hotline. Recently, World Vision, from the big organization, has joined us, but it's very hard to deal with it without appropriate support. We call on the international community to pay due attention to this problem and help develop strategies that would force Russia to respect international law and norm. Our organization is ready to cooperate with all scientific, diplomatic, and public organizations, and with international bodies seeking to find working mechanisms for the return of deported children and countering aggression. I appeal to the academic and diplomatic community in the United States and Ukraine. Your experience and support are extremely important in resolving the conflict and restoring peace in the region. We call to all big international organizations, all UN organizations. Our organization has probably the largest bank of children's stories, full of the suffering of children in conflict zone. We constantly highlight these stories in the media all over the world. And we believe that we will receive the support and we will not waiting, because it is our kids, it's Ukrainian children, they suffering and waiting for escape. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kuleba. That was very powerful. And thank you for your leadership and your courage and your call to the international community for support. Bogdana Yakovlenka, you are also one of the leading organizations working on the repatriation, setting up secure passageways for some of the children and families deported. Can you speak a little bit about how that is working and from whom you might be getting support or not?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for holding this conversation to my colleagues. Yes, I'm from the organization Helping to Leave, and we are a network of civilians who have organized in the first days of the full-scale invasion to aid Ukrainians, and our response is always shaped by the requests that we get directly from people. So which come through Telegram Messenger app chatbot or our call center. And of course, the main request was always evacuation since the very beginning, as the physical safety always a priority and of the utmost urgency. And through that, when we began our work already in the mid-March 2022, we began receiving requests from Ukrainians who were in Russia, which was at first very disorienting as we began finding out about the situation before it was even anywhere in the press. And through that, we began building a department which addressed which tried to address the issue and help these people evacuate in the safest way possible. And it is a part of this department's work to help children as well. We work on the evacuation from all parts of Ukraine. And of course, we always have to remember that when we talk about such war crimes, we have to look at the temporarily occupied territories, because without occupation, there is no deportation. So it all comes in a full package, unfortunately. But yes, our coordinators arrange evacuations for the deported Ukrainians without the presence of the volunteers on the ground in Russia, but in cooperation with the civilian underground resistance networks, which this communication allows us to first get the information on the situation right on the ground, from the people who are there, who are helping, the ones who are coming to us with the requests for help. All in all, we've evacuated more than 20,000 people from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine in the last year, not counting. So it's purely numbers from 2022, and more than 50,000 overall, and which includes the deportees as well, who were either evacuated to safe countries in Europe or returned home to Ukraine. And the way we operate is has always been, for the most part, reliant on the private donations. Usually it's small crowdfunding campaigns, which allows us to continue this work. But of course, we have not been able to access the support of the international community, international NGOs, even though we lead a lot of communication, we participate in this kind of advocacy work and communicate with colleagues like yourselves. But when we go to the partners whose mission is to help these categories of people, normally we're met with a lot of complex processes and conversations that an organization like ours, we have not been able to secure any support, because there's the practices in place are such that they do not align with the reality of the work, which is, it is dangerous. A lot of it we cannot speak of. We cannot give receipts and reports of some of the parts of this work, because it purely will put people who are there physically to sometimes assist if necessary. It will put them physically at risk. It will put people who we are helping at risk, and it will potentially end our ability to help any further. Yes, mostly it's have been just our individual efforts based on the support of the community that strongly supports us.
Thank you so much, Bogdana. It's very sobering to realize what you're up against. Katya, go ahead to the, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Bogdana, for telling us what work on the ground is done. we want to move to the international response and what has been done, what can be done more international level. We made our best efforts to invite representatives of various international organizations and agencies, but for different reasons, none of them was able to join us today. Unfortunately, we hope that they will be able to engage in the future, since they have a mandate and direct responsibility to act on this issue. Meanwhile, we're exploring alternative mechanisms of return of the children, and Ukraine has managed to secure some third-party actors in some important negotiations, including the return of prisoners of war or the grain deal. The question is whether we can involve anyone to mediate the process of child repatriation. Many countries are interested in solving this problem, but we would like to hear about the efforts and possibilities that are taking place in the US right now. And we're happy to welcome Stephen Schrage, the Executive Director of US Helsinki Commission, and David Schlaffer, the Principal Director of Ukraine in the US State Department Office for Global Criminal Justice, to talk about the work that is done in the US. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like me to start? I'm happy to.
Yeah, please, Stephen, why don't you go first?
Oh, no worries. I want to thank you for organizing this, and I appreciate your work at the State Department. I used to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary for International Crime under Colin Powell, so worked on many of these issues back then and in various White House and State Department congressional roles. But as director of the Helsinki Commission, we've really made this a key focus. And I want to applaud Georgetown for having this conference, not just talking about the issues, but specifically focusing on action. Because so many times we hear these things debated and discussed, but we're trying to look for things tangible that we can do that can really make a difference in the short term. And I think the statistics are overwhelming. I mean, you look at Ukraine's population of over 36 million that's impacted, 10 million diaspora, a third of the population displaced, over 5.9 million refugees in Europe alone, 90% women and children. I know Daria had mentioned about 19,000 verified children that had been captured or abducted to Russia. And we've seen numbers that are even far higher, some even into the hundreds of thousands of the children impacted. But I think the most powerful thing that we've seen as we work on this number is the lowest number, which is 1. And that is that the way that this has impacted individuals that have seen this and seen these war crimes and seen it firsthand with these women and children has mobilized a group to deal with this in the US political system. And I would say internationally that I've rarely seen. I was on the border a few days into the full-scale invasion at the Medica border crossing, the major border crossing. And when you see the impact that these war crimes have had on women and children, I think it just calls up this passion in people to do everything they can to assist. I know the chairman of the commission and several of our members, we recently traveled to Kyiv to meet with President Zelensky. And one of the most meaningful and moving pieces of that was a meeting we had at Bucha with a grandmother who held the light of her life, her grandson in her arms. His name was Alexander as he died. And you called on us to take action. So we've seen that, and the way this has brought people together across all kinds of political divides. We're in an area where we talk now about how divided the country is. We're a commission that is both House and Senate, Republican and Democrat, executive branch members, but we've had everyone from Chairman Wilson to the ranking member, Steve Cohen has been terrific on this, Sheila Jackson Lee, Ben Cardin, the senator. It just goes on and on and on. Richard Hudson. It's brought Victoria Spartz, who you probably know, is the first congressperson born in Ukraine. To bring all these people together and see the way they've moved forward on this has been inspiring. And then we were recently at the OSCE's Parliamentary Assembly, bringing together parliamentarians around the world. And we launched kind of a major initiative on this, as did several other countries. And we're all passed unanimous with support from Finland to Mongolia, North and South in terms of observers, all looking at this, going at what we can do on this. But as we've mentioned with this conference, a lot of this talk and resolutions are nice, but we all have to realize our enemy is not just, Russian war criminals or human traffickers on other sides of the border, but the enemy is time. because we've all, or at least those of us with gray hair, have seen other crises. And I think Daria made this point well, where there is this mobilization of action and passion to act, but real substantive lasting change doesn't get done. And that's why I praise Georgetown in this conference for bringing this together. Some of the irony can be too that while there may not be one single effective mechanism that fights this right now, there may be in some ways too many, and that there's so many people doing different things and doing really great work, but bringing it all together. One thing that we're doing, and this is going to be in the next 14 days, we plan to drop a major piece of legislation that we've been working on for some time. It's called Alexander's Law, named after the individual that we heard about in Bucha. And that law, I'm sorry about that. And so, you know, that we plan to do things that would develop a unified registry for children and all those fleeing Ukraine, you know, one-stop phone line to bring in the different actions and pieces together, international pressure on Russia with not just name and shame, but hard sanctions across the board, and pressure on other countries too, everywhere that Ukrainians are free, to make sure they're taking steps that we haven't seen as we've observed this even recently. Again, money and resources, which is important, but also ways to bring together the volunteers and the NGOs that have really the lifeblood of this effort, many of the people on this call. And again, we're really focused on that and looking forward to all your insights and all the great work that you've done. We're holding a major hearing on this. It's probably going to be the 25th or 26th. We'll have the U.S. Ambassador for Global Criminal Justice and for Human Trafficking, some of the individuals on this call, like Mikola from Save Ukraine. And we're very excited, again, about finding ways not just to highlight these efforts, which is important, but to make this happen and to defend and protect and ultimately empower the women and children of Ukraine who are going to be vital to its future. So again, we applaud all your work and open to ideas, but thank you for everything that everyone on this call is doing.
Thank you, Stephen. David, please take it from there. And if we could mention really briefly what's happening with the two resolutions that are currently present in the US Congress and US Senate on child deportation and abduction, that would be very valuable too. Thank you.
Thank you, Katya. And it's a real pleasure to participate today. Again, I'm David Schlafer. I'm at the State Department in the Office for Global Criminal Justice. Russia's officials and its proxies are operating a systemic, comprehensive program to forcibly relocate and deport tens of thousands of Ukraine's children. You know, we know this through research, through organizations such as Conflict Observatory, that all levels of the Russian government are involved, from President Putin down through local level officials who facilitate these movements. And the Russians are not even trying to hide this. In fact, Russia cloaks this action in hypocritical humanitarian language, insisting that they are rescuing children from harm's way. And in many reported cases, Ukrainian children are moved by Russian authorities without the consent of their parents or relatives, under extreme duress and using coercion. The United States is committed to pursuing accountability and justice for Russia's crimes committed in Ukraine, including crimes committed against children. In May of 2022, the United States, along with our EU and UK partners, established the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, the ACA, in response to requests from the Ukrainian Office of the Prosecutor General to assist in its investigation and prosecution of atrocity crimes. And my office, the Office for Global Criminal Justice at the State Department, has so far contributed $10 million to the ACA's lead implementing partner, which is Georgetown University. And this assistance has been used to facilitate trainings for Ukrainian prosecutors, to deploy subject matter experts in war crimes investigations and prosecutions, and sexual and gender-based violence. And this assistance to the OPG has already been impactful. Over 20% of all active war crimes prosecutions in Ukraine to date were directly supported by these ACA implementers. And addressing crimes against children is a top priority for the OPG and the ACA. So far through the ACA, we have assigned 8 international prosecutors who have extensive experience working on crimes against children at either international criminal tribunals or in their domestic judicial systems. And these ACA prosecutors serve as advisors and mentors to their OPG counterparts and work collaboratively with them developing cases. And in fact, ACA implementers have already provided specialized training to OPG prosecutors focused on crimes against children. They have provided substantial assistance and expertise in particular as regards comprehensive victim and witness support capability with a survivor-centered approach to help avoid re-traumatization. Now, as I mentioned previously, the United States also contributes to the Yale Conflict Observatory in Ukraine, which was also launched last year in 2022 with the aim to capture, to analyze, and to make very widely available publicly evidence of Russia perpetrated war crimes and other atrocities in Ukraine, including deportations and other crimes against children. The Conflict Observatory's report from this past February describes in detail the network of children's facilities that now stretches from Russia-occupied Crimea to the Far East, and the role of these facilities in coerced political re-education. And the United States government is active in other ways as well. The State Department's Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, USAID, other parts of the USG are actively involved in many different ways to stop the deportation of children, facilitate return, and hold perpetrators accountable. So our goal, the United States goal, is to work collectively with our partners in the international community to prevent and reverse the Russian government's forcible deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia, the relocation of Ukrainian children to Belarus, and the transfer of Ukrainian children to occupied Crimea. The unlawful transfer and deportation of protected persons is a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention on the Protection of Civilians and constitutes a war crime. The fact that these deportations are of children is unconscionable by any standard, and Russia must immediately halt forced transfers and deportations and return these children to their families. Thanks for the opportunity to participate today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, David. The U.S. has indeed done some very good work, and the Yale report supported by it did a tremendous impact on understanding and realizing the scale and the processes that happen behind the scenes in Russia with the abducted children. I wanted to very briefly point out that there are 2 resolutions right now presented in the House of Representatives and the Senate. House Resolution 149 condemning the illegal abduction of children from Ukraine to the Russian Federation, and Senate Resolution 158 condemning the deportation of children from Ukraine to the Russian Federation and the forcible transfer of children within territories of Ukraine that are temporarily occupied by Russian forces. I hope that these resolutions will be passed in the Congress sooner rather than later. And I wanted to very briefly mention the advocating efforts by the organization UNWLA called Return Ukraine's Children, which they started the advocacy campaign and working with the members of the US Congress to pass the above mentioned resolutions. And after the passage of these resolutions, they'll be asking the White House to create a White House task force to Ukraine to return Ukraine's children. And we will make sure to include information about their efforts in our list of resources that will be shared with the participants afterwards. Gillian, thank you. I think we can open a discussion about the obstacles and how to resolve them.
Yes, thank you. We are running short on time. This is a jam-packed panel, so I appreciate all of you chiming in and sharing such important reflections and perspectives. We have 2 people who've been sort of organizers on this, and I would like to give some space to Anastasia Marushevska. She's a founder of Where Are Our People? And you have had some important reflections on some of the gaps the obstacles that we're facing, in addition to what's already been mentioned, and as well as some of the possible solutions. So if you could speak, and then I'll turn to Nadia McConnell, who is the Executive Director of the US-Ukraine Foundation. Anastasia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to have a moment to speak. And I would like to emphasize something that previous speakers mentioned several times. I believe that one of the main obstacles is actually the limitations of the international humanitarian law, and also outdated and this inflexible approach of the international organizations such as the UN, including UNICEF and International Committee for Red Cross. I think it's very important to understand that the deportation, so-called re-education and militarization of Ukrainian children have been happening since 2014. And during this time, after the initial invasion of Russia, Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainian society managed to build very strong backbone. And what you can see now that most of the efforts that have been done, they're either done or led by the Ukrainians. We managed to build strong civil society. And what the UN and ICRC have been doing through these more than 9 years, I don't know. Because if they were expecting Russia to change and to start listening to what international community is saying, and after decades of endless wars and supporting of authoritarian regimes in different countries, that Russia will just give up their approach and will just listen and let go all of the deported children, well, this is ridiculous. So for me, I've been trying to understand what is the roadmap of actually those organizations participating into building the mechanism of repatriation and return of the deported children and adults. And I found out a lot of explanation of why they cannot do it, which I think for most of the people here are obvious, because they asking for access, Russia refuses, they cannot do anything. But there are some details into it. For example, ICRC claims that they have a very good representation inside Russia and inside occupied Ukrainian territories. However, they do not obtain any information about the deported children. As for now, we do not have names of deported children. We don't know where they are. We don't know their conditions. And nothing has been done to actually at least provide this information. So if there are representatives of ICRC or the UN inside Russia, I don't have an explanation why they do not have this information. So as for me, when it comes to dealing with real aggressor, with a terrorist country, international humanitarian law and the idea of neutrality fails. And I believe that international organizations such as UN and ICRC either not who they claim they are. They're not the independent keepers of international humanitarian law and rights of people. Either they need to change their approach. I believe the first one is to actually understand what is Ukraine and what is Ukrainian civil society. And to understand that we're not waiting someone to come and explain us why killing people is bad. We don't need lectures on how to be humans. We need real results. And if they cannot provide these results, they need to be honest about it. And they need to relocate their budgets to organizations who actually do the job in the field. As for now, as we can see, I even saw the question from the audience whether ICRC helping, not in the way that we could imagine. And organizations such as Helping to Live or Save Ukraine, they do not receive any support from these kind of organizations. So what they're doing, meanwhile, We do not know, because again, there is many explanations of why they cannot tell us what they're doing, why there is no results, etc. So I believe one of the obstacles is a huge one. Because as the global security system, the way it's built now, the UN and ICRC have a very important role now there. So if they cannot provide basic results, at least names and locations of Ukrainian children, then I believe that this system doesn't work. And I think this is very important questions to raise every time, because when we were talking with Gillian before, she shared like this idea that people in different countries, they hear about this horrendous crime of deportation of children. They believe, okay, there is UNICEF, there is ICRC, they're doing something with it. And they don't feel like they need to push their government to do more, that they don't need to call for it, because there are organizations that we trust. We give them this, I would say, all of the power to actually change it. And they do not do this. And they do not have power to influence Russia in any manner. And I believe that this is a reality that we need to face, and we need to at least push them to be honest about what's going on, and to understand how they actually can be useful under these circumstances.
Thank you, Nastya. That's a sobering reflection and a reminder that we all need to be really mindful of who is doing what and who can do more. Thank you so much. Nadia, I'm going to give you 1 minute, and then we're going to do a final round of final comments, very, very brief from each of the panelists. Nadia, can you tell us about the planned conference you have in December?
Well, first, let me just as background offer my real deep respect for all the work that's being done by the Civil Society of Ukraine. Working in Ukraine since 1990, civil society has always been at the forefront. I think one of the issues that have been, a lot of issues have been brought up, and I think there's a realization that the challenge of keeping the world focused on this issue, understandably, because you've got things going on like the Vilnius summit on NATO. Monday, we had a webinar about the potential crisis around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And then, of course, the humanitarian catastrophe around the Kakhovka Dam explosion. So we are in a very challenging environment, but there are things I think that we can do and will do together. One, I think, is to build a global coalition of organizations. And many of you did join us April for the roundtable we had on this issue. I think we will together be able to amplify our voices. I think the other thing is to build, and I've discussed this with some of you, a strategic calendar around which we can all rally for different advocacy efforts. And there are certain dates that are very critical even coming up. Somebody's mentioned the UN General Assembly meeting, but I also would raise the issue of UNICEF Day in November the 20th. If you look at the plans for this event, which is supposed to be for the protection of children, there is no mention about children victims of war. It's about access to water, gender equality, and the like. So I think this is, again, our challenge to the organizations that have some responsibility for this issue to include this very critical issue in their agenda. This webinar, Ken Gillian, thank you for organizing, I think is important for just another step to get the world to focus on us. I believe that also we need to continue to have very significant events, discussions like we've had today. In that regard, we had a roundtable in April. We are announcing that on December the 1st, we intend to hold a global summit here in Washington on this issue. Along with that, besides building up the global coalition of organizations, and I do want to also just put emphasis of Steve from the Helsinki Commission. It is very important that they are talking about introducing legislation. Remember, legislation has the force of law. Resolutions can be important for drawing attention, but I think we need to focus on also getting this resolution passed. Stephen also mentioned the fact that there have been efforts to rally public officials, elected officials, not only from the United States. So the idea of possibly creating an ad hoc caucus of elected officials from the US, from the European Union and Ukraine that will help us keep a focus on this very critical issue, but also have strategic concrete action plans that we can all gather around and work towards. So again, my humble appreciation and respect for all the work that you all have been doing on the front lines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadia, very much for your input for organizing the event. We are moving to final statements by the participant, and I will shamelessly take advantage of my position as a moderator and just provide a few points on my own. I just wanted to say that despite the fact that many organizations are truly interested in returning children deported by Russia, it may feel sometimes that we kind of accepted that it's impossible and that we have to win the war first and then deal with it. And it is not acceptable to me, and I don't think it should be acceptable to anyone. If this war has proved anything, is that impossible is nothing. And if there is a will, there is a way. And we have to return children now while they're being psychologically tortured, brainwashed, and forcibly Russified, because every day spent in Russian captivity is exposing them to the risk of being adopted. There are no excuses for us or anyone not to help children, and we cannot afford phrases like there's nothing we can do, because we are the adult at the table, and it is our responsibility to take care of the future generation. And I hope that each of us leaves this webinar with an idea that we can do and have to do something now to return abducted Ukrainian children.
Thank you, Katya. Let's go to Vladislav. What can you say in a 45-minute wrap-up?
Yes, thank you. I want to say just one that based on historical background, we all know that forcible deportation, it's not new practice, but it's a forcible practice and violence of from Soviet times. And the main point is that Russian occupiers want just to destroy and to erase Ukrainian national identity and Ukrainian nationality at all. And we should immediately to return our children, because every day Russian could do forcible Russification and militarization of these children. It's very bad for physically and for mental health of these children, and we should immediately return these children to home.
Thank you, Vladislav. Mikola Kuleba.
First of all, thank you so much for this event, for this discussion. It is so important to meet here on this floor people who are united for Ukrainian children, for rescue more kids. Just now we finished our 8th rescue mission, and now we have 128 children who've been abducted, and we return them and reunite with their family. We have a special Hope and Healing Center for these families in Kyiv, where children with their families live, and all of them are war crimes witnesses. We have no solution now for rescue more kids, but we are 100% sure that these children are captured and they are hostages in this war. And my call is to find effective mechanism. And my call is for actions from big international organizations, from United Nations, ICRC, and all organizations who must do something to help return more kids. And we are moving ahead for our 9th rescue mission. But it's harder and harder, because just for the last 3 months, we've seen how Russians blocking our rescue missions and any returns of any children. Can you imagine? They force mothers to go through lie detectors, and now one grandmother awaiting DNA test just to prove that she's a grandmother with all documents. What next? It's my question. What next? And we understand that Russia will never stop if we will not be united and not to find a mechanism, effective mechanism, how we return them. Thank you. Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you, Mikola. Katerina Rashevska.
So I would like to use this opportunity in order to make some highlighting, because you know the United Nations Secretary General's recent annual report on children and armed conflicts doesn't contain any mention of the illegal deportations and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children. This is because, in the opinion of the Special Representative for Children and Armed Conflict, such minors are not adopted and therefore fall outside her mandate. But you know, Gamba is almost the only one independent international servant who was admitted to the territory of the Russian Federation, who had meetings with Maria Lvova-Belova and others suspects of the international crime. And that is why, being here, I would like to highlight, I would like to insist that illegally deported and forcibly transferred minors of Ukraine should be considered disappeared for the purpose of establishing the fact of their abduction until they obtain another legal status. It's really important because this is the only way to eliminate the legal vacuum for these children and to contribute to the protection of their rights and freedoms. So we are adults, and as Katya already mentioned, we need to protect them. These children need us. We are professionals, and this is the great time to unify our efforts and to help these children go home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katerina. David Schleifer.
Thank you. And I think very briefly from my closing remarks, what I'd like to do is to quote from Secretary Blinken. And I think that these were remarks that he gave actually at the UN. I know they were at the UN on the 1-year anniversary mark of the full-scale invasion. And Secretary Blinken said at that time, Bucha is not normal. Mariupol is not normal. Irpin is not normal. Bombing schools and hospitals and apartment buildings to rubble is not normal, and stealing Ukrainian children from their families and giving them to people in Russia is not normal. I think that we need to remember those words. I think that we, the international community, both national partners and international organizations, must not allow these crimes to be normalized or committed with impunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Vakhtana Yakovlenko.
I would really like to end on a note that highlights the fact that this work is very serious and very urgent, and a lot of big and powerful and smart and educated people are involved. And I think sometimes it can create a barrier in understanding that this sort of activism can actually be adopted by absolutely anyone. Like in our organization, which consists of people from all walks of lives, from baristas to historians to teachers to fashion photographers like myself, if we can evacuate thousands of people and organize and cooperate together with the civilian networks, with organizations of all shapes and sizes, then the large NGOs and the actors who are aimed at helping these people can definitely do this work. And I hope it inspires a little bit more action and less helplessness in something that is certainly very dark and very difficult.
Thank you so much to everyone. This is a remarkable panel. Thank you for showing up, for being honest, for sharing your truth, for sharing the challenges, for challenging us. We can all do more and better. Having worked in this space on the issue of separated children for more than 20 years in a variety of different contexts, I can say that it is the frontline actors, the people on the ground, the communities, the community-based organizations, the volunteers, the parents and the children who are actually always leading in the response. And so for all who are watching from international institutions, from the international community, please find these people, lean on them, learn from them, support them. They are the solution, and it's our job to help them. Thank you so much. May all the children be safe.